JRPG is a strange term. Back in the 1980s, clusters of nerds across America purposefully trapped themselves in their basements, performing the satanic ritual of rolling dice and telling silly stories to each other, also known as Dungeons and Dragons. Like most satanic rituals, the stories being told around the table were translated into computer code, and those stories turned into computer role-playing games. These role-playing games were understandably simple. Players would take up the mantle of a little pixel guy traveling around the world, often by their lonesome, in an attempt to conquer whatever world they were playing within. Ultima and Wizardry are just two examples of the genre's beginnings, themselves based on text-based adventure games in one way or another. Years of evolution occurred. Wireframes turned into pixelated objects, one color turned into several, mechanics became more complicated, party members became a staple of the genre. Across the Pacific Ocean in Japan, deals made by American video game developers and Japanese publishers would see these games roll out into Japanese markets. The RPG had taken hold by some, and for others, it was a source of inspiration. Yuji Horii was a fan of games like Ultima and Wizardry. He had developed games in the past, such as the Portopia serial murder case, and he was far from the first Japanese dev to look at RPGs and say, "Yeah, I can definitely do that." Arcade games like Druaga saw players navigate a tiny pixel man through a vast dungeon, collecting keys and unlocking doors to make further progress. Hydlide was perhaps more in line with role-playing games, as it featured health bars, experience points, and other facets of the genre that we know, appreciate, and even sometimes criticize. Horii, however, had a very specific set of goals in mind for the game he wanted to develop. Firstly, he wanted to develop it for the Nintendo Famicom, which is like an NES, but more cool and sleek and better in every way. I mean, have you seen this thing? Forget Michelangelo or those other old fogies. This was the meaning of art. The problem for developing for such a sleek and beautiful system was the controller. 3 face buttons and a directional pad. This was at a time where the video game market in Japan was split between the magnificent little device and these big, clacky keyboards that would have your father screaming at you from down the hall for making too much noise on the Saint machine. The only reason you have a Saint machine to begin with is so he can do his damn taxes. Did people do their own taxes on computers back then? I could fact check that, but I think it's funnier not to. The point is, keyboards had many keys to press, whereas Nintendo developed a controller with very few buttons to press. It simplified the concept, but it would also pose a challenge to those who wanted to develop more strategic games. Hell, this is still an issue today. I watch my friends play Baldur's Gate 3 on a PlayStation 5, and I can barely understand all the buttons they have to press to trigger whatever spell they're going to use. But you know what? At least that game functions. It's only been within the last few years that we've been able to see some sort of future for Cripigs on consoles, let alone Ritzes and Mamaura Pigs, barring some exceptions. On top of reducing all of the actions of an RPG to be possible using a controller, he also wanted to create a game that was simple to understand, yet instantly fun to play. Something accessible for youth and adults, while still creating a vibrant world to get lost in for hours and hours. He wanted to take a Western medieval aesthetic, seeing the scenarios of samurai and shoguns as too safe for the Japanese market, and he wanted to give them something they hadn't seen much of before now. Churches, castles, knights in shining armor, knights in no armor, knights with no flesh, swords, axes, ghosts, goblins, little brain boys, little vulture worms, green dragons, blue dragons, red dragons. Horii was far from the first to achieve any of these goals. The aforementioned Druaga and Hydlide both borrowed from medieval fantasy, and had both been arcade games with limited button layouts.
Okay, this is future Brendyn just saying that, Hydlide was a game for the PC-88. Later released on the Nintendo Entertainment System with a limited button layout. But as far as I can tell, it was not in the arcade. That's my bad.
But there's a reason we aren't talking about Druaga and Hydlide today. It's because I didn't play those games. I played Dragon Quest. Okay, I actually did play a little bit of Druaga when I was a kid, unlike that Namco Museum collection for PlayStation 1, but I'm not qualified to speak on that game whatsoever. Actually, now that I think about it, I'm not really qualified to speak on any video game, and yet here I am, speaking, through the power of technology. Thanks, Satan. Dragon Quest was far from a one-man effort. The game itself was developed by Chunsoft, with Hori focusing on the story and general gameplay mechanics. He recruited acclaimed manga artist Akira Toriyama, best known at the time for Dr. Slump and, well, a little itsy-bitsy manga you've probably never heard of called Dragon Ball. This came about through a Shonen Jump editor who kind of appears in stories all over the place about the topic, relating to the company in some way at this time, whose name is Torishima. And Torishima was an editor at the magazine, and he was Hori's boss. He connected the two, telling Hori that Toriyama played Portopia and really, really wanted to work on a video game. And this was, of course, utter bullshit. Toriyama had absolutely no intentions of working on a video game, but he did indeed play Hori's previous game, and so a working relationship started to form between the two. Hori would send Toriyama rough sketches of what he wanted for monsters, and Toriyama would just ignore them completely to draw his own ideas, which were 1 billion times better than whatever Hori had sent along. The Dragon Quest slime is just one example of this. Hori had sent Toriyama the typical blob, and Toriyama came back with the signature teardrop design with the goofiest face anyone had ever seen up to that point. And thus, players would murder hundreds of these adorable blue bastards for eons to come. The end. But no, that's not the end. In fact, this is still the opening. I haven't even got to the point of this essay yet. Don't worry, I will. I just think it's a little fun to drag it out. By way of meeting through a Sudoku survey, Hori recruited... He was a classical music composer, and it told Hori that classical music never lost its appeal. Video game music should then be similar, as it would have to be listened to for hours upon hours upon hours upon hours upon hours upon hours upon hours. Crafted one of the most delightful soundtracks of all time. And while I can't play them here for copyright reasons, his soundtrack for this game and the rest of the series are just truly compositional masterworks. I say as someone that is not qualified to speak on classical compositions. I just listen to the same Bomb the Music Industry record day in and day out. I'm only qualified to speak on that one Bomb the Music Industry record, and even then my qualifications can be and have been disputed. What I am qualified to say is this game's main theme is constantly stuck in my head. I'm just walking around my apartment shouting the tune at the top of my lungs like I was performing a hardcore rendition at the skeediest club in town. With the work of these three and the folks at Chunsoft, the first Dragon Quest came to be. Japanese gamers ate it up. American gamers would eat it up 3 years after its initial release, after a bunch of unsold copies were given out with Nintendo Power magazines and a strategy guide. The American version also saw many changes. Censorship, the ability to point the protagonist in a direction without having to open up a menu, and of course, my favorite of them all, an English translation that takes way too many cues from Elizabethan diction and grammar. The name was also changed to Dragon Warrior to avoid copyright issues, a title that would persist all the way to the series' 8th entry on the PlayStation 2. Dragon Quest was declared a certified banger. So much so that it inspired a billion jillion other video games in its wake. Hironobu Sakaguchi saw Dragon Quest and wanted to develop his own RPG for the Famicom, and went on to release this little-known game named, Final Fantasy, 1 year after Dragon Quest release. And I mean, that's just one example. You can look at most Japanese role-playing games and just see exactly where it takes inspiration from Dragon Quest. I mean, the Mother series, it's Dragon Quest, but in a modern setting. Shin Megami Tensei, Dragon Quest, but focused on dungeon crawling and demon recruitment. Pokemon, Dragon Quest, but with monsters. Hey, wait a second. Dragon Quest is, in many ways, the Japanese role-playing game. It allowed players to take control of their little pixel man with a controller rather than a keyboard, and gave them a non-linear world to waltz through at their own leisure. It gave them dungeons to explore, obstacles to overcome, and even a princess to rescue. And it was all packed up in an itty-bitty Famicom cartridge. Since its release, the term JRPG has been used in a million different contexts to mean different things. It has been used derisively to refer to those role-playing games bogged down by their own tropes and created outside of the fantastic spectacularity that is the US of A, who could never do any wrong. Never. Not once. It's also been used endearingly by people like myself, referring to a set of tropes and mechanics with love and appreciation. It's also been dropped altogether by some, as it becomes more acceptable and really more accurate to classify RPGs by mechanics over what region they were made in. turn-based RPGs, strategy RPGs, action RPGs, and this is probably the optimal route. We wouldn't classify Elden Ring as a JRPG, would we? It strays so far from the established genre that the descriptor fails to make any sort of sense outside of denoting which region it was developed in. And the region it was developed in hardly matters. I see more JRPGs coming from non-Japanese countries than I do Japanese countries. Is that the line I wrote? But it just further indicates the term has withered into being kind of useless. So before we go any further, let me define what I mean when I say JRPG. While I don't think the term is all that useful these days, I do think it did denote a certain type of RPG being developed in the 80s and 90s. Games with similar narrative and character tropes, and mechanics that became less relevant in the Western RPG scene as they took a different path, focusing on further complicating the formula developed in the early 80s. Just know that my use of the term isn't meant to be disparaging, nor even all that relevant. It's just useful in this very particular case as we discuss a game that set the foundation for so many others that would come afterwards. A game that laid the groundwork for the games I would play as a youth, and even the games I still play today. My introduction to the first Dragon Quest was through the emulation scene back in the late 2000s. As a youngster, I had a habit of downloading all sorts of ROMs and emulators to try out video games from before I was born. This was how I discovered the Final Fantasy series, amongst others, playing small sections of each game until I got bored or until my grandfather saw I downloaded a bunch of suspicious shit on his computer and he kicked me off of it to go play PlayStation or Game Boy or something. I can't remember much of Dragon Quest from when I first played it. It didn't leave much of an impression on me like Final Fantasy did. However, I would return to the game in high school, 2015 to be exact. Emulators had become popular smartphone apps, and as I forayed into this part of emulation, I decided it was time to try Dragon Quest once more, playing the SNES remake with a translation patch. I would skip off math class to hang out in the bathroom and play it on my phone, taking delight in the vibrant pixel art and straightforward yet charming adventure. Dragon Quest was my first introduction to what I would now call a break time game. A video game played in short increments, mostly as a distraction from whatever I was supposed to be doing at any given time. After several weeks of playing in spurts, slowly leveling my character through tackling dungeons and grinding monsters in the overworld, I eventually came face to face with the final boss, the fiend we've been searching for since the beginning, the Dragon Lord. He had offered me the chance to join him, to which I replied with the slash of my blade. And as we fought, he slowly transformed into a great blue dragon, hurling fire from his maw and attempting to excise me with sweeping claws. After a hard-fought battle, I had won. I recovered the ball of light stolen by the Dragon Lord and returned peace to the land. For my efforts, the king offered me his great kingdom, to which I replied that I could not take it, as I would rather find my own kingdom instead. There was a great kingdom that awaited me back in ye olde reality, a long line of storied video games to which I, the eager nerd I was, could sink my teeth into. And yet, I didn't. I played 30 minutes of Dragon Quest II, and then closed the book on my adventures. It would be years before I picked up another Dragon Quest game. Not until 2020 when I played Dragon Quest XI on my Nintendo Switch. I had been turned off from the series by the criticisms I had seen of it online. Some called it stale, others said it fell back on its tropes too much, and some just said it was downright archaic. After having played around half of the games in the series, I disagree with all of these points. Dragon Quest may be a series that never goes too far outside of its norm, but it has never rested on its own laurels. Each game presents an adventure starkly different from the last, with its own themes and oftentimes its own mechanics to go along with them. Sure, they're all aesthetically similar. Being drawn and composed by the same dudes for years upon years would do that to a series. But besides that, they are all vastly different experiences, all worth playing in their own right. Well, I don't know if I agree with that either. You see, I recently went back to the original Dragon Quest, curious on how it held up. And that experience was somehow enriching and infuriating. For every positive mark the original left on the series and JRPGs as a whole, There are also negative mechanics that would follow down the line of JRPGs for years upon years, as if it was a Bible passage that just desperately needed to be scribbled out to prevent hatred and animosity years down the road. I've come to the conclusion that Dragon Quest is as much a paragon to the success of JRPGs as it is to the genre's weaknesses. Progress halted by poor direction, with players having to talk to nearly every NPC, some just very well hidden, to potentially hear where they may have to go next. The incessant need to grind, destroying an otherwise balanced difficulty curve, so balanced that it's the foundation for every other Dragon Quest game of the series, just utterly decimated by a lack of meaningful gameplay to keep players up to par. These are Dragon Quest's flaws, and they persist through its own entries, as well as through other JRPGs. Dragon Quest is an amazing game. Dragon Quest is also a very frustrating game. And as much as I never want to play Dragon Quest again, I am somehow drawn to keep trying. I am trying to love Dragon Quest. I decided that for my playthrough of Dragon Quest, I would have to make my way through the original NES version. And there were a few reasons I decided this. Firstly, I had never played through this version of the game before, and secondly, the English translation, although hilariously littered with Elizabethan dialogue, would be potentially more cohesive than a fan translation patch. Maybe that isn't the case, but I've also played enough fan translations to know that those folks have a habit of taking liberties, to put it lightly. The NES version boots to the now classic Dragon Quest opening theme, a theme that I would love to play for you if not for YouTube's stringent copyright guidelines. Also take notice of the glistening O, which stands for, "Oh my god, stop staring at the logo and start the game already." Dragon Quest has a very simple premise, and that premise is given to the player almost immediately by way of a decree from the King of Tantagel. The hero Erdrick once vanquished all of the monsters from this world using a sacred ball of light. This ball of light has since been stolen by the accursed Dragon Lord, who is razing towns across the world in his path towards total domination. The king thus asks you, the little blue knight standing in front of him, to find the Dragon Lord, smack him with a stick, and steal his ball. A guard in the castle lists the player's second objective. Rescue the princess from one of the Dragon Lord's minions, the Green Dragon. These are but two objectives that the game lays out for the player. Others will become clear as the player navigates the non-linear play space, exploring towns and caves as they search for information to help them accomplish their first two goals. But before any of the story can take place, new players are tasked with creating their character, the descendant of Erdrick. This character creation, though only a single menu signaling the player to enter their name, is deceptively deep. This name isn't just what the player will be referred to during their playtime. No, this name configures the player's stat spread for the entirety of their journey. Each character the player can enter has a distinct value associated with it from 1 to 15. The game takes the first 4 characters of the player's name to determine the rates of stat growth. The player character has 4 stats: strength, determining attack power; agility, determining speed and defense; maximum HP, determining total hit points; and maximum MP, determining maximum magic points. The naming system works in that the name value determined from the player's name will slow down the growth of 2 of these stats, while the other 2 stats will experience standard growth. Yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? That's a bit of a mouthful. Keen players aware of this facet of the game will manipulate their name to obtain a name value corresponding to the stats they prefer. If the player, for instance, wants to prioritize strength and maximum HP, they will have to choose a name that grants them a name value of 13. The name J is an example of one that would grant the stat spread. For maximum HP and MP to remain standard, players would have to aim for a name value of 12, making exclamation point a popular name for these players. Using less characters to achieve a desirable stat spread will also give a higher bonus to the penalized stats, making their stat growths in the early game improve while they drop off later in the journey. This bonus can be anywhere from 0 to 3, but regardless of the bonus, these penalized stats will suffer a 10% decrease in growth compared to the standard growth rate. Yeah, that's a lot of math, and I'm not even sure if I really understand it all correctly myself. It is intentionally convoluted, which I now see as a staple of all Dragon Quest games, and a trait passed down to its numerous offspring. Pokemon is notorious for having secret numbers that influence statistical growth, from the relatively easy-to-understand nature system, which, by the way, is pulled from Dragon Quest III's trait system, to the oft misunderstood Eevee and Ivy systems that have only become less obscure within the series' last couple entries. These secret numbers have been both celebrated and derided for various reasons. In a game like Pokemon, they have the effect of making each one different from each other, even if they're within the same species. The downside in that series is the competitive aspect. If you intend to battle online, or even to complete some of the game's post-game challenges, you may require a Pokemon with desirable natures, EVs, and IVs. Dragon Quest, however, can revel in the benefits of the secret number system. Like Pokemon, each Dragon Quest character will now be slightly different depending on the name they have. And although it doesn't change up the way players will tackle the game's challenges all that much, it does provide ample reason for players to return to the game after completion, just to see if they can beat it with a character who has a different stat spread. That is, if they're aware of the naming system at all. I used an online calculator at GameCorner.net to decide on what my name would be. I settled on Baka, which has a name value of 27, and thus impacts the growth of my maximum HP and MP, while strength and agility stay the same. I'm also granted a bonus of 2, which makes the decrease hurt that much less in the early game. It's after naming our character that we awake at the beautifully manicured toesies of our beautifully pixelated king, who tells us of the plight that has stricken the land. Upon detailing our quest, he allows us to open the nearby chest to obtain some gold, a torch, and the magic key. The gold will be used to buy our starting equipment, since we decided to come to the castle without any clothes on, nor a stick to ward off the dastardly slimes outside. Dragon Quest reveals one of its core gameplay mechanics while conversing with the king. He mentions that you should speak to the guards in the castle, who may offer information on where the hero should go next in order to fulfill their quest. Speaking with NPCs is a staple of any role-playing game, as they're often willing to point you in the direction of your next goal, or potentially a goal to keep in mind for much later in your journey. In the traditional tabletop setting, this acted as a way for the game master to relay information to players through the world they have created, rather than just outright telling them what they would have to do next and breaking immersion in the process. And immersion in a role-playing game is damn near essential. We as players want to believe the world we are adventuring through is ripe with life and culture. Stats and narrative can only go so far in keeping players invested in a game, especially ones as long as role-playing games. Making the world feel believable keeps players invested in it, and as a consequence, keeps them invested in the role they play. Get it? Attempting to achieve immersion through an 8-bit video game is really tough, to say the least. The level of abstraction behind the idea and what's being shown on screen is wide, and considering many Dragon Quest players in 1986 probably hadn't played a whole lot of role-playing games before this, it would take a lot more imagination to see what the game is trying to show you in terms of its world building. Or perhaps it was easier at the time, seeing as the limitations of the NES were not yet seen as limitations. I mean, who's to say? What I can tell you is that it was Hori's goal to have players become lost in the world he created, and that he accomplished. Speaking to every NPC makes Dragon Quest a slow burn of a game. It's not just about collecting information. If that was the case, every NPC would have something useful to say, which, well, spoiler alert, they don't. Several NPCs insult the player for claiming they're Eritrix's descendant. Others make some random quip that has nothing to do with anything. My favorite of these useless NPCs lie behind a locked door in the next town, where the player uses a magic key to grant them access to the room. And inside are 2 guards, each telling you to talk to the other for more information. So not only did you use a valuable resource to break into this room, you get squat for it. This, again, helps build this world to be more than it is. Sure, it's comical that these NPCs exist within the cavalcade of NPCs with actual information, but it's also true to life. Some people are just gonna fuck with you, and these 2 are just one example of it. It gets a laugh, sure, but it also helps make that aforementioned abstraction easier to buy in the process. Another hint of this world-building prowess is visible as soon as the player steps outside of the castle. As the timeless overworld music plays, the player can head south to see a castle across the sea. This is the final dungeon of the game, Charlock Castle, home of the Dragon Lord. Dragon Quest makes this sort of setup a habit very early on, revealing places the player will no doubt go later on by granting them a little peek of what's to come. It builds anticipation while also making the world seem grander than what's already available to the player, which is a lot, by the way. After purchasing some equipment and talking to NPCs in town, the player's next action will more than likely be to wander around the world in search of one of their 2 goals. Going south of Tantagel Castle reveals a cave, surrounded by mountains, inaccessible for now, but something to keep in mind for later. Heading north, we'll see the player stumble into a dusty old tomb, lacking any monsters, but nonetheless vital in their quest to defeat the Dragon Lord. It's here, in Erdrick's resting place, that you, his descendant, are told of the 3 objects needed to access the castle across the sea, all guarded by friends of the ancient hero. This is another goal the player must keep in mind, essential to achieving the main goal of defeating the Dragon Lord. It also tutorializes the design of this game's dungeons. They're dark mazes where torches are necessary and courage is required. The lack of any threat makes the dungeon a breeze, but for many players, this would be the first dungeon they would ever step into. It was important that it not curb the player's enjoyment right off the bat with enemies that could make their initial experience all the worse. Instead, the player will face their first enemies in the overworld, random encounters that present themselves to the player inside a box, sometimes with an accompanying background design, though that's only in the overworld. The player fights these wicked beasts from a first-person perspective, choosing from several menu commands in an attempt to outwit and outdo their foe. The player can attack, cast a spell, run, defend, or use an item, all of which resulting in both the player and the monster committing to their actions in an order dependent on their agility stats. Toriyama's art is expertly translated into 8-bit, with all of the character of his original designs captured through pixels. Monsters are cute, they're hideous, they're goofy, they're sly, they're aware of their own strength. They all have personality, thanks to the artists who somehow managed this on the NES. The perspective of the battles is also interesting. We never see a player sprite in battle due to the first-person view. It feels as if it's you, the player, facing down the monster in front of you. While I often prefer the side profile that Final Fantasy would originate, this angle is immersive in its own way, and something each of the games would improve on with flashier animations, more intricate designs, and beautifully colored backgrounds. But battles are barely battles without the battling. The only options available to the player right off the bat are attacking, defending, running, and using an item. Spells are listed, but the player doesn't learn their first spell till level 3. If the player was smart and went into town, they may have picked up some gear to help improve their attack and defense. A weapon, a shield, a piece of armor. These add strict statistical advantages to attack and defense and will be necessary to upgrade as the player goes through the game. With equipment on hand, the player will more than likely spend the early game slaying slimes and drakis, eventually moving on to ghosts and wizards as they venture further north towards the second town. By defeating enemies, they'll gain experience and gold, and at this point it's at a very low rate. But nonetheless, it will allow leveling up and the ability to buy better gear. And as level ups occur, so too does the learning of spells, of which there are 10 in the game, all learned by level 20, the max level being 30. One of the first is Heal, which restores between 10 to 17 HP. Hurt is the first player's attack spell, learned at level 4, dealing between 5 to 12 damage to an enemy. Unlike some RPGs, spells are not impacted by stats. In fact, it would take several sequels for Dragon Quest to introduce a way for players to increase the potency of their magic. All spells like this rely on their ranges, for both the player and the enemy. Other spells don't have ranges at all, but instead trigger an effect, either in or out of battle. In battle, sleep can be used to, put enemies to sleep, delaying their actions for turns at a time until they wake up. Stop allows for players to prevent their opponents from casting spells, useful for pesky mages and those who are trying to put you to sleep. Outside of battle, spells like Radiant, Outside, and Return are incredibly useful. One creates a torch effect in dungeons, one teleports the user outside of a dungeon, and that last one brings the player back to Tantagel Castle, where they'll inevitably want to go as they can save their game there and check the progress to the next level. Spells all require MP. MP often dictates how long the player can stick around in a place before they need to rest in an inn. Players who have low health will use their heal spell, costing 4 MP, to restore their HP. MP provides a hard limit on this, and due to the decreasing deficiency of herbs and the amount you'll be paying for them, using magic to heal will more than likely become your number one way to keep from an early death. However, as much as you try, you will die in Dragon Quest, and you're going to die plenty. As soon as your hit points reach 0, you are defeated and suddenly appear in front of King Tantagel, who says it is not yet your time. You'll also notice that half of your gold has magically disappeared from your wallet. Yeah, God's a cheap bastard. To prevent death, the player will most likely have to train themselves on weaker monsters to level up, better preparing them for the tougher monsters they'll encounter on their journey. This is the catalyst of Dragon Quest's delicate difficulty balance. Each area encountered provides a tougher challenge for players to overcome. Monsters with larger health pools, the potential to do higher damage and cast higher level spells. And while Dragon Quest is incredibly open-ended, allowing players to travel pretty much anywhere at any time, the encounters will stop them from making too much headway in an area they aren't supposed to explore yet. The player needs to be able to meet these monsters on their level if they want any chance of getting by, and becoming strong enough to take on the next area's enemies isn't always an easy task. Lots and lots of grinding are necessary to make it through Dragon Quest, and in the early game, this grinding is gamified by way of optional dungeons. The aforementioned mountain cave we saw at the beginning of the game is one such place where players will most likely train. The cave is not essential to progress in any way, but it provides a chance to farm experience from monsters while opening chests for gold and other treasures, though those treasures will not always be as desirable as you may hope. The grind, in this case, feels like a natural part of the experience. However, this will not always be the case. There are not enough optional dungeons to go around in Dragon Quest, and the low XP and gold yields of most of the enemies will make grinding against specific foes more enticing over time, especially as the necessary XP to level up and the gold needed for your next upgrade increase. While chests and dungeons reset and allow for more gold to be collected, it's easier to grind on a mid-game enemy known as a Goldman to farm for higher grade weapons and armor later on. Taking chances on tougher enemies of hopes of higher EXP yields will almost always dominate a player's instinct to stick around in the same area, defeating the same monsters for hours at a time to become stronger, although players will eventually have to succumb to the latter in most cases. This grinding, a necessity throughout the game, turns that delicate difficulty balance into utter chaos. And I say this as a person who actually doesn't mind the occasional grind. Most Dragon Quest games require it to some degree, whether it's getting a new, weaker party member up to snuff, or developing vocations in some of the later titles. However, I almost always find it more enjoyable in later games, and that's because of the way it's gamified. For a grind to be engaging, in my personal opinion, it needs two things: a worthwhile reward, and a process that is in itself enjoyable. I find most Dragon Quest games nail this balance, often through the use of metal slimes, near invincible enemies with limited health who often only take 1 damage per turn and have a high rate of fleeing. They're hard to kill, but if you do, party members are almost guaranteed a level up thanks to the experience they provide. Of course, they're hard to find most of the time and can easily slip out of your grasp, and while they exist in Dragon Quest 1, I think I only found 2 in my entire playthrough, and I did a lot of grinding. Metal slimes may sound like a pain in the ass, and they certainly can be, but the player is often entering battles and gaining experience and gold while they look for metal slimes, making the hunt a grind in and of itself, outside of the initial experience grind. It keeps it just a little more interesting and a hell of a lot more rewarding once you've taken down a slime or two. Another thing to keep in mind is that all Dragon Quest games after the first feature multiple party members, and multiple enemies to battle in any given fight. This simultaneously lessens the need for grinding, as having more than one party member can mean one or more can die without a game over, and the battles are generally easier with more options available. And it also increases the amount of gold and XP received by way of battling more monsters at once. Grinding may still be needed in other Dragon Quest games, but nowhere near the amount it's needed in Dragon Quest I's late game, where the best equipment will cost nearly 10,000 apiece, and the enemies struggle to give out more than 100 gold a fight. A significant portion of my playthrough was dedicated to grinding, and unlike in some other games, the grind is incredibly boring. You're usually stuck fighting weaker monsters since the tougher ones can kill you and ruin all of your hard work farming gold, and it will take hours to get to where you need to be to travel to the next area safely. Near the end of my run, I began using fast forward on my emulator to make it less of a pain, and honestly, I don't feel bad about that at all. I honestly recommend it to anybody who wants to play this game, especially the original NES version. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. The progression of Dragon Quest isn't just tied to the player's level, but also the objectives the player has completed. Upon leaving Tantagel, many players will make their way to Garanom, where they'll buy new equipment and discover a large building, locked and inaccessible until they can track down more magic keys. To the east of Garanom is a small village deep in the forest, called Cole, where shrewd players can find a fairy flute on the ground. It's invisible, and requires talking to a random NPC to know what area it's in. This presents a fatal flaw in the NPC-driven progression of these objectives. The NPCs might not always be all that helpful, and finding the right one to lead you to your next goal will become tiresome and will require a lot of aimless wandering. However, the 2 towns we've explored so far show just how far Dragon Quest goes to make each location feel different from the last. While dungeons may be similar in many ways, each town has its own atmosphere, its own concept, and its own personality and charm. Garnam is obviously dominated by the giant locked building, with everything built out around it. Locals will tell you it's named after Garin, a famous bard. Cole is designed with its forest aesthetic at the forefront, with buildings developed out of logs and an appreciation for nature embodied by just how open and secretive it is, being found in a quarter of the world that lacks any other developments. The only location close by is a small cave, where the player will meet a wise old man who tells them of the Staff of Rain and the Sunlight Stone, 2 of the items needed to access Charlock. He will give you the Staff of Rain if you give him Garin's harp, found in his grave behind the big locked house in Garanom. This also raises questions about Garin. Was he a friend of Ergix perhaps? A companion? Or maybe this old man was just screwing with you and wanted his harp for himself. Who knows? But the questions that spur from this quest help reinforce that this is a living, breathing world, only it's packed inside an old Nintendo cartridge. South of Cole is a dangerous dungeon with several purposes. The first is that it allows travel to the centermost continent, providing access to the town of Rimildar, where magic keys can be purchased. The second purpose is that this is also the location of the Green Dragon and the captured princess, both of whom you can skip to trudge forth to Rimildar. The cave is surrounded by a swamp that deals damage to the player, another way of gaining progression for those too weak to sustain the damage being done. Rimildar, like other towns, has a lot of personality. It has several bodies of water and has this real mystical vibe portrayed through its NPCs and general design. The magic key shop in the back of town allows us to carry as many keys as we have inventory slots, which isn't many. Still, we grab 7 keys and head back to Tangential Castle to begin opening doors throughout the game. A knowledgeable player will open the locked doors in Tangential Castle to find a man who says stealing is bad, while he watches you pillage all of the gold in the nearby chests. An even more knowledgeable player will find another magic key salesman behind the castle, although it requires a magic key to get to him, and locks reset once you've left the area. The most knowledgeable of players will venture to the southeast corner of the castle, finding the Sunlight Stone, one of the items we need to access Charlock Castle. Going back to Garanom and exploring the large building will reveal another secret, a curtain that can be passed through to enter Garin's grave. This will, as mentioned, help complete the old man's quest and net the player the Staff of Rain. After some more traveling and grinding, the player will eventually take themselves back to the swampy dungeon to face off against the first real boss, the Green Dragon, which triggers once the player steps on a certain tile. And trust me, this guy is no joke. His attacks do massive damage, and he requires quite a few hits to take down. Using spells here are necessary, not only to heal, but to put the dragon to sleep and to allow for more damage to get through while you hopefully take none. Without sleep, this fight would be much, much harder and would probably require even more leveling. And while it's not the most reliable spell, with only a 50% chance it'll work and a 33% chance the enemy will wake up every turn, it certainly gets the job done. And honestly, it felt really good to develop this strategy and let it play out, securing me the win. This is as deep as Dragon Quest's combat gets, and for a first foray into a yet-to-be-defined genre, it does its job. Players are presented with multiple options to make their way past obstacles like this, and the strategies they devise truly feel like their own. I do wish more battles took this type of strategizing into account. There are some late-game enemies that I use the stop spell on, and I would continue to use sleep here and there to take care of tougher baddies, but other than the occasional use, it mostly never saw the light of day, primarily because I wanted to conserve my MP for healing. It's another example of Dragon Quest not yet finding a balance between its mechanics, and something later entries would iron out with more party members and a wider variety of options. The defeat of the Green Dragon means the player can finally rescue the princess, carrying her all the way home to Tangential Castle. This was a very memorable moment, with the devs creating a whole new sprite for your character carrying the princess. And once you drop her off at her father's, she gives you her love, which acts as a mobile experience reader, and also tells you how far you are from the castle, which will be very useful as we track down the final item we need to get to Charlock Castle. And like that, we've completed our first objective. Princess rescued, which is kind of odd, don't you think? Usually saving the princess is something saved for the end of a video game. You know, Mario Bros, Zelda, etc. It's a strange decision to make it so the player will rescue the princess halfway through the game at a midpoint dungeon, but I also think it's kind of brilliant. One thing I've yet to really mention is the narrative this game is attempting to convey. I say attempting because, again, that abstraction between what is happening on screen and what is being taken for information in the player's mind is quite vast. But Dragon Quest has a lot of fun with this abstraction, as we've discussed with its world building, and I think its narrative is really similar. On paper, the story of Dragon Quest is very simple. You're the descendant of Erdrick, tasked by your king to save the world and also the king's daughter in the process. Everything the player does from that point on is a means to these ends. Collecting the items held by Erdrick's friends' ancestors, finding magic keys, defeating the green dragon. The steady player progression throughout. It can feel like a checklist that you're crossing off as you go, but again, that's only on paper. In reality, your journey throughout the land itself is the narrative. Learning tidbits of information that will help you on your quest, meeting some interesting characters that will no doubt leave an impression, your personal quests to get stronger and take on optional dungeons. All of this is player-driven, and Dragon Quest is a player-driven game through and through. While writing this, I had some trouble remembering the items needed to get to the Dragon Lord. However, I could vividly recall the Star Wyvern who put me to sleep and cut me up like a ham. I remembered the two guards pointing at each other saying, "Talk to that guy." I'll cherish the thought of my battle against the Green Dragon, pulling out all the stops to ensure my victory, and then the act of carrying the princess home in my arms, which, by the way, that's just peak Dragon Quest. It just is, okay? Like, it's the most Dragon Quest that this Dragon Quest gets. This goes hand in hand with the game's non-linear progression. While the difficulty curve asks that the player stay on a specific path, there's not much else stopping the player from exploring areas that they shouldn't really be in yet. It reminded me of starting Dark Souls for the first time, standing in Firelink Shrine, and seeing these 3 directions I could go. 1 resulting in progression, and 2 resulting in a brutal ass-kicking for yours truly. But now, as an experienced player, I almost never go the intended route, as it always feels better to shake things up by going on a more difficult path. Although the numbers may not agree with you on this, the player can essentially do the same thing, as long as they have lots of herbs, lots of heals, and are intimately acquainted with the run command. This opens the door for a whole other kind of narrative for the player, one that may check off all the same boxes as the former, but is shaped entirely by the new experience the player has thrown themselves into. This is, in my opinion, the beauty of open-ended role-playing games. And although Dragon Quest disincentivizes this kind of play through its difficult encounters, it's still possible with enough resilience and fortitude to make it through some tougher areas with a weaker character, leading to an entirely new type of experience. And ultimately, it's that experience that becomes the player's narrative, a story not forged by the creator of the game, but by those who consume their creation. It was Hori's intention to create a game that drove people's imaginations into overdrive, and in this aspect, I think he absolutely nailed it. And as JRPGs would go on to tell more grandiose stories with characters whose biographies could rival the Odyssey in length, I appreciate the simplicity all the more, and it's a simplicity that continued throughout most of the Dragon Quest franchise. With the Green Dragon defeated and the princess saved, the player's sights will naturally land upon their next goal: collect the last item needed to access Charlock Castle and defeat the Dragon Lord. Of course, there are several other things to do before coming face to face with the root of all evil. To the south of Tantagel are a few locations we have yet to visit, mostly because the monsters in those parts are just monstrously powerful. It took a lot of grinding for me to be able to take down some of these tougher enemies, but once I was strong enough, I marched my way down to the southernmost part of the map. On the way is a town left in ruins, the result of one of the Dragon Lord's attacks. This is Hawksness. You may have heard tell of it from NPCs throughout the game. All that's left of it is rubble, with monsters prowling its otherwise empty streets. This is a perfect example of the world building Dragon Quest is committed to. Each location, even those that seemingly don't exist anymore, have a story to tell through environment and townspeople to talk to, or in this case, the lack thereof. Skipping past Hawksness will eventually lead players even further south, and eventually east towards the next town, Cantlin. This is a large merchant town with a golem guarding the entrance, potentially from the late game monsters that inhabit the area. An NPC from earlier in the game notes that the fairy flute we found much earlier in Cole is used to put him to sleep. So, after slapping the sleeping giant silly, players can explore the large town and all it has to offer. There are several merchants here who sell the second best armor and weapons in the game, including the flame sword, which we're after. To get this, well, you guessed it, I grinded for an absurd amount of time. Grinding at this point is a real pain in the ass. I basically focus on gold men since the enemies outside Cantlin still give me a run for my money, but after a few levels and thousands of dollars earned later, I can purchase the new equipment. An NPC here tells us that Erdrick's token can be found in a swamp, giving us very specific coordinates. This is where the princess's love item kicks in. Using it, we can find exactly where the invisible item is to, and are now ready to go to Charlock Castle. There's just one more thing we need to do. Back in Hawksness, there's an axe armor guarding Erdrick's armor, which heals hit points on every step and makes it possible to travel on dangerous terrain without taking significant damage in the process. The axe armor is a tough fight, as he likes to use my tactic of putting foes to sleep, but a simple stop spell along with some heal mores make the fight a breeze. And now, it's finally time. West of Rimildar is a small river separating the city of Magic Keys and the Dragon Lord's lair. It's here that we use our collected items to create a rainbow bridge to travel to the final area of the game. The enemies here are strong, and the enemies in the castle are even stronger. Dragons, elite wizards, axe armors, all gunning for us as we race to the Dragon Lord to put an end to his dastardly deeds. Sometime earlier, I remembered an old man mentioning the Dragon Lord's throne. So, as we traverse the first floor of the castle, I check out the throne. And lo and behold, there's a breeze coming from it, almost as if it were a separate entrance. But before we go towards the Dragon Lord, I remember another NPC's words, saying Erdrick's sword can clean-cut steel. Well, that sword is in this castle, and I intend to find it. After navigating the maziest of mazes, I find Erdrick's legendary blade and properly prepare myself for the final fight. We march through a room that seems utterly decimated, as if it were lost to time itself. Water runs freely as pillars crumble. We navigate the ruins until we see him, the Dragon Lord. He offers us a deal. Join him and rule the world together. I deny his request, as it would have meant all my grinding was for naught. I slay him with 3 decisive strikes. I raise my arms in triumph. But the celebration is cut short by his second form. A hulking beast of a dragon, perhaps the coolest sprite in this entire game. The Dragon Lord hits hard. Whether it be swinging his claws or breathing fire, this guy just is not playing around. I have to keep my HP above 50 at all times for risk of death. My damage also isn't fantastic, but this isn't the first time I've been put in a poor position fighting a dragon. We trade hits back and forth for what feels like eternity. Heal, swing, swing, heal. My MP can't last forever, but neither can his stamina. My sword comes down, slicing his head down through the middle. His cerulean hide cracks. Like every monster before him, he poofs out of existence. The victory chime plays. I won. The Dragon Lord is defeated. Long live the Dragon Warrior! With the ball of light in hand, we use it to vanquish the monsters from this world and make our way back to Tantagel. A parade of soldiers await me, as does my beloved waifu and the King of Tantagel. He offers me his kingdom, and in response, for the first time all game, I finally speak my mind. I cannot, said Baka. If ever I am to rule a country, it must be a land that I myself find. The legless Guilin joins us as we leave the castle and the land of Dragon Quest to find our own kingdom. It felt gratifying beating Dragon Quest again. It had been years since I played, though I certainly had fond memories of my first playthrough. It was a way for me to escape the dreary existence of the everyday and experience something that, while archaic by modern standards, was nonetheless a fantastical world worth exploring. I still think Dragon Quest is that same world of fantasy. I love the subtle world building and the player-crafted narrative. I have so many stories from my time playing this game that I cut out of the final script of this video due to, well, irrelevancy from my central thesis. But it's those stories that form the true narrative of this game. And I think that was, at least in part, Hori's intention. He wanted players to use their imaginations, to go into this world with open eyes and see what they wanted to see. Much of the information in this game must be interpreted. Other information in this game is damn near impossible to find, hidden knowledge trapped within a single NPC dialogue. But regardless, I think I've seen what Hori wanted players like me to see, and that I can certainly appreciate. With that being said, I also don't know if I'll ever come back to this game again, even for the 2D HD remake coming next year. While the combat gave me some tricks to play with, it's obvious by the way Dragon Quest moved on from 1v1 battles after the first game that even the dev team saw it was limiting. As did fans of Dragon Quest. There's a reason Hironobu Sakaguchi went with 4 party members in the first Final Fantasy game after all. A handful of spells and a linear equipment progression and leveling system can only take you so far, and even if it did wear on me, I did still enjoy these aspects to some degree. What I did not enjoy was the endless amount of grinding. It felt like every other session was dedicated towards leveling up and farming gold, and as I've explained, there are ways to do this that feel less hindering to the overall gameplay and less like a waste of time. What feels like a delicate difficulty curve spirals out of control near the mid-game, and it takes an even harsher turn near the end. It's challenging, but when the solution to overcome the challenge is grinding rather than strategy, that's when I have to consider whether or not I really want to continue playing. And Dragon Quest certainly had me asking that question at several points. I toughed it out, but even while utilizing speed up in some instances, the grind was painful. Every JRPG to come after Dragon Quest takes something from its design. It could be as simple as the decision to use low numbers for calculations opposed to higher numbers. It could be the way stats are calculated for individual characters. It could be aspects of its world building or player-driven storytelling. But the game has also influenced negatives that have led me stray off many a game. Never-ending grinding, simplistic combat, feeling lost in a world hesitant to give you any sort of direction. Dragon Quest has no doubt influenced the rest of its series. The one-party member formula is still replicated in certain passages of the most modern titles, such as sections of Dragon Quest XI or even Dragon Quest V. The world building is always there, and has gotten even stronger over time, with vignettes often accompanying each new town the player visits, making their relationship to that area all the stronger. Even the statistics stay relatively similar to the original, though grinding is often made either less of a necessity or made to feel fun in some way. Dragon Quest is often talked about as a series too tied to its own tradition, and while I disagree with that argument, it's in the evolution of these concepts that I can see where those people are coming from. It's no Final Fantasy, changing everything about itself in every iteration. It tells a different story every time, from different perspectives, with different gameplay systems, but the core of what makes Dragon Quest what it is lies deep within each entry. And outside of its own bubble, I don't think we would have any of the JRPGs we love today if not for Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy is probably the biggest example, but so is the Mother series, Pokemon, Shin Megami Tensei. I'd even go so far to say Dark Souls wouldn't exist without Dragon Quest. The level of abstraction between concept and idea in those games are sort of like an extension to what the original Dragon Quest was doing, although in a much more complex way. And for all the negatives I have to say about this game, I will readily acknowledge that they don't really matter that much. It's a game from 1986 and a progenitor of its genre. Of course there will be flaws and issues. What good is done by me, a 25-year-old white dude from rural Newfoundland, complaining about them in 2024? Dragon Quest's legacy has already been cemented. Hell, it's been cemented for over a decade before I was born. None of what I said can compare to that legacy. So I basically just wasted nearly an hour rambling for no reason, I guess. But no, there is a reason, right? Games are only as important as they are important to us, the people who play them. Sure, we can say something has a legacy, but that legacy isn't set in stone from the get-go. Rather, it's reinforced by the numerous voices who have at some point said, "This rules." So, while I still have a voice, let me say this. Dragon Quest, you are a unique piece of art, as complicated and entertaining as you are frustrating. But no matter what curse words I shouted while grinding for hours on end, you definitely rule. Thanks for watching. Hi there. Yes, this is the end of the first video of what I hope to be a series of videos detailing my experiences with the video games. So yeah, I just wanted to record a little thing at the end here as you hopefully watch credits roll by. Just give it a little bit of further information, a little bit of a miniature post-mortem, and also a thank you to you for clicking this video and giving it a watch. I do greatly appreciate it. It was a weird experience making this. It took several months, much longer than I thought it would. But, you know, life happens. What can you do? But I really enjoyed the process overall. There was a lot of rewritten scripts. I basically scrapped a whole video in the making of this and then completely redid it to the product that you see now, and I'm glad I did that. The first one that I was in the process of making wasn't really up to snuff, and honestly, I'm still not like entirely happy with this one. You know, I felt like there was so much I could have said and then just didn't. But you know, at some point, I know as you know, being a writer, you gotta just cut it and say, "Here, world, have it. I don't want it anymore." And that's kind of the point where I'm at. So yeah. Regardless, I appreciate you watching. I will say I have tried to credit everyone I think I remember using their content, and they should all be scrolling across your screen right now. But if you do notice something that you think has went uncredited and you can find that credit, I would ask that you just shoot me an email at brendyncorrections@gmail.com. That is BRENDYNCORRECTIONS@gmail.com. And I'll take a look at that, and if I need to alter the credit, I will do so in the description of this video. I'll have a little space there to add that if need be, and also do the same if there are any corrections you'd like to make. You know, we are not perfect. I have tried to source what I can, but if I've made a mistake, let me know. Send me an email. Correct that information. I will make sure that correction is accurate, and I will also put it in the description of this video. But yeah, other than that, I have other videos in the works currently. I'm recording this about, I think, 4 or 5 days before this video goes up, so my nerves are shot, and they will be until this goes live. But again, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this stupid long video, and I really do truly hope that it added a little bit of, I don't know, something to your day, whether it be something you didn't know, or I don't know, maybe you just like Dragon Quest and wanted to hear some idiot on the internet ramble about it for an hour. Either way, I very much appreciate it, and till next time, have a good one.